Hi, Eli.
Hey Bob,
Hey,
happy Peace Fest 2013.
thank you. I knew you'd want to join in the festivities. Let me
Yeah,
introduce us.
it's fantastic.
I,
It's like
I'm.
like
I'm.
Hanukkah.
Let me tell. It's not that good. It's just world peace breaking out.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
Hanukkah is the most overrated of the Jewish holidays in my view, but that's a separate
wasn't it
story.
kind of semi-invented so that around Christmas time Jewish kids wouldn't feel left out? Not invented, but it was
It was a
elevated.
minor
Yeah.
holiday that celebrated what would be the equivalent of like the Jewish kind of fundamentalists of the era under the Assyrians.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm all for it. And also for this Peace Fest thing, let me explain. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Eli Lake, noted journalist
Dick
um,
Beast.
at the Daily Beast, and we're talking about this deal with Iran, which I infer from Twitter you're not wildly enthusiastic about, but maybe I'm wrong. You tell me.
Well, I mean, a lot of this is sort of if we start to see a lot of steps in the future that I'm not holding my breath about, then it could be great. If this is the beginning of a wider, comprehensive understanding where the leaders of the Iranian Green Movement are released from house arrest, and the Iranians, begin to compensate the families of the victims of terrorism, and they verifiably begin at least putting in the transparency measures and maybe dismantling things that people think are, evidence of a nuclear weapons program, then, it's
Anything else you'd
a great
like?
accomplishment. It's a great accomplishment.
Anything else you'd like, Eli? If we could, maybe we could get an Ayatollah to do some house cleaning for you or something. I mean, how long is this wish
I
list?
think those are serious. Those are
Well,
serious objections to the regime's behavior over the years. I think
well,
those
one step at a time. I mean, as for
moral
the
security.
but let's summarize the deal
Okay.
itself, okay, and see what we agree on and disagree on there. I mean, there is some opposition to it derives from the view that it actually does nothing constructive on the nuclear front, even, and may actually do damage. So let's just say that what it is billed as doing, and what I think it does, and you can amend my remarks, but what forward motion there had been toward possible weaponization, it basically stops. And in addition, there's a certain amount of rollback in the sense that the 20% enriched uranium, which was only like two steps away from weaponization, or that's the closest to weaponization, that will be converted to less weaponizable form. But I think the biggest thing, and there's some other things, but I think the biggest thing is the transparency. I mean, we're going to have cameras where we want them, including at Fordo, the deep underground facility, and international inspectors will have the right to inspect the cameras every single day on a daily basis to make sure they haven't been tampered with. I believe this is unprecedented in the entire history of arms control in intrusiveness, and I think that's an important precedent, and grants genuine reassurance about what's going on. But now, why don't you?
Well, the issue with intrusiveness was always the spot inspection process, which we're seeing actually in Syria. Like, if I can pull a challenge card and say, I think this is a facility that's all bad, and then you're supposed to, the way it's supposed to work is say, okay, well, you can look at it in a timely manner. Historically, that hasn't worked with the Iranians, and it historically hasn't worked in general. I mean, there were notorious kind of cat and mouse games played in Iraq, in the 1990s on this question of, I can challenge you. Now, I don't know what exactly this agreement does in terms of that.
I can answer that question. I
Yeah.
can answer that question.
Okay.
I think this interim deal. We should also say this is an interim deal.
Interim deal.
It anticipates 6 months of
Right.
negotiation, and if all goes well, there will be a final, more comprehensive deal at the end. I think this does nothing in the way of inspecting undeclared sites on short notice, which you're talking about, but the widespread expectation is that any final deal 6 months from now would have Iran signing on to what's called the additional protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran has signaled in the past they could in principle do. That would allow these kinds of challenge inspections of undeclared sites. So I think that the answer is it's not in the interim deal. Everyone expects it to be in the final deal.
Well, yeah, but that's a big, and you get into what I think is a bit of a Rumsfeldian position, which is you don't know what you don't know. So and it's very difficult to speculate. It is obviously, we can kind of address this better from a historic perspective. So Natanz was not declared, and eventually, my view of it is that the Western intelligence agencies knew about it, and it was publicized by a group called the MEK, which is the People's Mujahideen. I guess you could call them an opposition group that has in the past.
Until very recently, you could call them an officially designated terrorist group.
Still, right, not recently, an opposition group that doesn't mind terrorizing the Iranian regime, and I guess
and killing the occasional American if you go far enough.
Well, you go far enough back,
yes.
right? They were responsible probably for an attack in Kuwait against the French and the United States. So that group did that in 2002. Then fast forward to 2009. And you have the Fordo facility, which the U.S. had dead to rights, and the CIA considers that one of their great successes. I was recently talking to somebody about that, and the Iranians kind of came clean on it. So there is a history with the Iranians of cheating in significant ways, because building a facility like that underground and military base is a pretty big deal in the world of non-proliferation. So the idea that you would get a full accounting of the totality of the program is, I think, always been, from an arms control perspective, one of the most important gets. And I guess what we both are saying now is that that's not totally there yet, but that would be there in a final agreement.
That's the widespread anticipation, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a piece about a month ago based on a very senior, recently retired CIA officer who I can't say who it is because it was, on deep background, but he said that it would be very easy for Iran to have a warehouse somewhere in Tehran or one of their big cities where they could begin enriching weapons-grade fuel somewhat under the noses of the international community. I think in some ways you could argue, well, that would be really perilous for them right now if they did that, because if they were caught, it would ruin every chance they would get. They'd get more sanctions and so forth. So perhaps there's an argument here that it's not in Iran's self-interest to cheat the way they were now that they're so close to getting a lot of these sanctions lifted in full. But nonetheless, that strikes me as a sort of, that is a part of the agreement that we'd say has to be negotiated or ironed out later.
Right. But just on that point, I read that piece,
yeah.
and I would say, first of all, if indeed there is the capability of enriching at various undeclared sites, and if indeed that's going to get easier to do on a smaller scale with more dispersed enrichment, then it is all the more important that we get what we're hoping to get at the end of 6 months. This kind of challenge inspection thing, but also, well, then what is the alternative? That also means that bombing cannot work if you don't know where the things are. I mean, at least with the additional protocol, if you have a suspicion, you can find out. But you can't just be bombing every time you have a suspicion, right? So the alternative to some kind of negotiated solution seems to me to look grimmer, all the more grim by virtue of what you're saying.
I don't think that bombing known facilities gets you out of the woods, because some of this is just the knowledge of the scientists and engineers that build all this. So you can't bomb someone's knowledge of nucleonics out of them. That's impossible. They have obviously worked on it. What you can do is, what's been done is, they sabotage, they sanction.
Assassinate people who do have knowledge.
But I think the Israelis probably do that to the chagrin of the Obama administration, as I gather. So yeah, you have, it is a bit of a shadow war, and the Iranians do stuff too. So what I'm interested in is, this is a very narrow agreement, at least the public, what we've been told about. And we now know that there have been other talks that have been going on. So are there other, is this the way to get to a broader understanding, so that you basically have a ceasefire or truce to the shadow war, which encompasses a lot of those issues I mentioned at the beginning of the bloggings? And that I don't know, because they don't, this is so narrowly focused on just these proliferation concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the bigger threat to the deal, to the deal at the end of 6 months, is the way they have left the issue of enrichment. Well, first of all, they left it vague, and I think maybe it got vaguer as negotiations wore on after the French intervention, which we can talk about. Maybe you know more than I do, but this is the question of whether Iran will, in the end, in the final deal, be allowed to enrich at low levels, like below 5%, which they are allowed to do in the meanwhile.
Right.
I think everyone believes that any final deal has to have that there really is a red line for Iran, given domestic constraints, not just in the sense of what the hardliners want in Iran, but the people support a right, the Iranian people support a right to enrich. But let me just finish explaining what I'm saying, and then we can argue about that part. But and Iran wanted the most affirmative, the most affirmation possible of what they call a right to enrich. We don't know what was in the deal, the draft deal that was torn up, the U.S. draft that was torn up several weeks ago when the French stormed in and apparently said they weren't happy with things. But it seems to have, gotten vaguer and less affirmative, not just of a so-called right to enrich, but of any expectation that they will be allowed to enrich at the end. And I think, unfortunately, John Kerry has, since the deal was signed last night, been kind of emphasizing, that, hey, we're not, there's no right to enrich in here. He's almost been asserting that it's not the expectation that they'll be allowed to enrich in the end. And I think what he's going to discover is that he is giving fuel to the enemies of a deal who will use his words against him to try to keep any enrichment out of a final deal, and that will doom a deal. I don't think he's playing this very smartly. I think we're seeing the kind of senatorial, John Kerry, who maybe talks a little more and with a little more self-absorption than is optimal from a diplomatic point of view. But what do you think?
Well, technically Kerry is correct. I don't think a final deal will have the United States or what's called the P5+1, which is France, England, Germany, China, Russia, United States, saying the NPT grants Iran a right to enrichment. And by the way, that is in part because, future understandings under the NPT, nobody wants to set a precedent where you allow a country like Iran to, derive this right to enrich when you want countries that have been far less violative of the NPT in the past, they could claim, hey, well, if Iran can enrich, why can't we? So they've been I think he's correct technically on the very narrow point of international law. But the agreement that was signed in Geneva does say that eventually a final status understanding would involve a mutually defined enrichment program with practical limits and transparency measures to ensure the peaceful nature of the program, which is basically saying that Iran would be allowed to enrich in a final deal. Iranians have been saying this for about a month now that they would get that. That's one of the reasons they're so happy. But the text of it actually says that. I think I just wrote a piece on this. It's fairly significant. And I should say that this was a formula that's kind of been discussed probably for 2 years. This is not the first time the P5+1 has had these talks. So, we should say that, there's been a process going on for about a year and a half, 2 years, where they've talked about this. But earlier offers from the Obama administration in his first term wouldn't allow Iran in the final deal to enrich. And certainly the Bush administration never envisioned allowing Iran to continue enrichment after a deal. So that is a fairly significant evolution, if you will, of a Western position.
I'm happy to hear that language, which I hadn't heard before. And so I somewhat withdraw my complaint, although I think Kerry's still making a mistake in the way he's handling this rhetorically. But that gives me that will make it a little harder for enemies of the deal to try to undermine it on those grounds. Although we've already heard, I think, from Corker or some senator that their goal is no enrichment in the end, which would, in effect, doom the deal. I think you're right.
Don't you think it matters a great deal? Like if Iran continues to enrich a small number of centrifuges that really can't provide it with what they call the breakout capability, well, then that is a very different matter than if they are allowed to keep their 18,000 centrifuges they have right now spinning all the time, which means that they could, at some later date of their choosing, decide to break out. So in some ways, the details still matter a great deal. And because those details were not specified in this current interim deal, I interviewed David Albright, who's a pretty smart guy on these things, and he says, that's his concern. It's so vague. In theory, if Iran wants to do a little bit of enrichment, and it's at a small level, and there isn't a danger that that low enriched uranium could then be quickly turned into nuclear fuel for a weapon. He says that doesn't really bother him. What bothers him is that it's so vague in this particular.
Yeah, let me say a couple things. First, David Albright is, I think, kind of on the hawkish end of things. He's a of the actual analysts of the nuclear technology. He's the most likely to be quoted by, I would say, hawks at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and so on. So he's kind of on that end of the spectrum. Having said that, I
think the administration deals with him. He's a fairly
he's kind of seemed to move to the right, and it's been a controversy within the community. But anyway, whatever. He is definitely taken seriously. I think he's, first of all, I would say, it's not clear yet. This is what's going to be more clearly specified in the final deal. And in the meanwhile, they're not allowed to increase their net stock of low enriched uranium. That total, because if they create more, they've got to neutralize the existence. So they've agreed to no net increase and no net increase in centrifuges. So it's kind of frozen that, and presumably the exact specifications of the enrichment capacity will be spelled out in the final deal. So no, we don't know yet. The other thing I'd say is, breakout capacity is a very vague thing. It refers to, do you have the ability to, in fairly short order, create a nuclear weapon? Well, what does a short order mean? They've got breakout capacity in some sense already. And the question is really in what sense they will have it in the future. Because as you said, you can't destroy the knowledge, So, the question is, how close will you leave them to the ability to create a nuclear weapon? And we'll see, but I've got to think, if Israel is as concerned as they say they are about an Iranian nuclear weapon, and I actually don't think that's their central concern in truth, but if they are, I would think they should be happy with a deal like this, because
they're not.
I know, I've noticed that they're not. You picked up on that too?
On television.
Wait, what'd you say? I didn't hear you.
I mean, my source is that their leaders keep saying how terrible the deal is publicly. It's kind of unprecedented in terms of the recent U.S.-Israel relationship. Usually, when a Secretary of State comes to your capital, you have a meeting, you don't walk out of that meeting and saying this is the deal of the century for Iran, which is what happened actually about 4 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. When Kerry went to meet with Netanyahu, I think it's worth pointing out here that at the end of the day, there wasn't a vote on sanctions before this latest round of talks, which the administration, the White House said would potentially ruin. I don't quite see how that works because the president can veto it, and he can stop the sanctions if he wants.
But Congress could override if you look at the magnitude of some of these sanctions votes, right? They could override a veto.
It's interesting that there wasn't a vote, and I don't think they had the votes, and I think that to a certain extent, AIPAC is powerful lobby, but they're not all powerful. And I never bought the idea that they could overrun. I mean, this is something that's coming from the President of the United States. U.S. executive branch controls diplomacy. There's a limit to what Congress can do in that situation, and I think you saw that limit because there was the end. I mean, what do they have? There was a sanctions amendment to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that had 5 Republicans, including, Mitch McConnell. And then there were a lot of statements, letters, and things. I think Chuck Schumer doesn't like this deal. But again, we live in our republic is such that the president's in charge of foreign policy, and it's his diplomatic initiative, and he doesn't necessarily need to have an authorization from Congress if he chooses not to get that. And I don't think he has that authorization right now. So,
and I think aside from that, I think people in Congress rightly do not want to be in the position, if there is war with Iran a year or two down the road, of being held responsible for having derailed a deal that could have prevented war. I think there's a little sensitivity to that. And I think that a number of senators are kind of trying to have it both ways and stay in AIPAC's good graces on the one hand, but not being seen as dooming a deal on the other.
Yeah, I don't think I can tell you that I'd heard some grumblings from others in the pro-Israel community that AIPAC didn't do enough. My view is it wasn't there for them politically. When a Democratic president tells Democratic lawmakers, you know what, we don't want the sanctions right now. We really think we're close to a deal. You got to give us some space. That's a very hard argument, I think, to counter. And I think sometimes, when we discuss this, people realize, people have to realize that it's the arguments that also carry the day. And for a Democrat, it's much easier for a Republican to say, you know what, I don't trust this guy, Obama, screw him. It's much harder, I think, for a Democrat to do that.
Now, do you agree with me that for both Israel and Saudi Arabia, although what they focused on was the issue of nuclear weaponization per se, that they both have a certain fear, whether rational or not, of U.S.-Iranian rapprochement?
No.
You don't?
No, I think this is about the fact that in the region right now, Iran's behavior, particularly in Syria, particularly in terms of, if you go back like 2 years, but what Iranians would say are retaliation for the murder of their scientists. The Israelis just saw, what we saw in Bulgaria and then in New Delhi and things like that. And then the Saudis see their own pressures, and they look at Bahrain and other Gulf kingdom, which they blame Iranian interference on the Shia, kind of uprising. Not buying necessarily the entire argument there from the Saudis, but that's how they see it. So they see the Iranians politically and, paramilitarily in the region exerting lots of influence and really becoming very aggressive. At this moment, they are like, why the hell would we want to cut a deal with them? We need to fight them. And they don't see Obama doing that, especially after Syria, when it looked like Obama was about to get involved and then said he wasn't going to because he decided not to decide just yet and was asking Congress. It was like kind of a crazy moment. I think that and then to see this deal kind of unfold, they just think that Javad Zarif and Hassan Rouhani and the new regime are lying, and they just don't think that there's a deal there. And I think that they would, if they saw something that was evidence of more reasonableness, particularly in Syria, where the Iranians have really doubled down on Bashar Assad as he continues the slaughter of his own people, they would probably maybe be more inclined to say, all right, maybe there's an opening. But they don't see it in their backyard, so I think that they're like, what the hell is wrong with this guy, Obama?
Right, but I'd say two things, and here, and I think I feel a segue coming to the human rights issue you want to discuss, but first I would say a couple things. First of all, there's certainly the prospect that if this deal brings more communication and even collaboration between the U.S. and Iran, which there has been in the past, you could start seeing Iran playing a more constructive role on some of these fronts. There have been hints of that. There's discussion of that, certainly active discussion of that already in the case of Syria. Beyond that, looking further out, if you want to talk about the prospect of true rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran, I think that would have to be good for Israel, because true rapprochement cannot happen if Iran's external behavior does not change somewhat. American domestic politics would not permit rapprochement with Iran if Iran's use of Hezbollah was exactly what it's been in the past, right?
It's allowing it now. It's like, listen,
yeah, but we have no leverage now because Iran is basically an enemy. We have not been in the position to say, look, if you want our collaboration on X, we want to see this change in your external behavior. This is the grand experiment that can finally begin. It may fail, but it can only begin once you're talking to them.
I don't know. I look at it like this. Like, at this point, I think they want this nuclear deal, and if they get the transparency measures that we discussed, then on that point, I think they will be able to say, listen, we got to deal with the world as it is. And we have more inspection, we have more transparency, we have a better handle on it, we have an agreement from them not to, have more than this much LEU. It's not perfect, but it's better than we were before, and that's how they'll sell it. But keep in mind, like last week, the Supreme Leader gave another one of his speeches. He said it 1,000 times: Israelis are rabid dogs, yada yada yada.
No, now, didn't he say Netanyahu was a rabid dog? Wasn't it just Bibi who was a rabid dog?
Oh, I don't know.
There's a difference. There's a difference. But surely you would agree that Bibi is a rabid dog, right? There's no controversy there.
No, I would not agree he's a rabid dog, but okay.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, of course. No, but I'm saying, I know, I hear you. But every time there's this game that's played where an Iranian leader says some horribly offensive thing, usually about Jews, though they say terrible things about Baha'i and all kinds of things because they're.
I've heard the occasional
leadership
"Death to America" chant.
Racist, rapists.
Too.
I mean, that's what they are. But the it was like the response in Geneva to Khamenei's remarks last week was this like on background, it's not helpful. And I realize that at the end of the day, these kinds of diplomatic, it's very symbolic. It doesn't really matter the substance of things. But when you're in a negotiation with somebody like that, it means that you have to a lot of times turn the other way. And I think the Iranians are kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. That's all.
I think there's also right now a little playing to their hardline constituency in the course of getting this deal validated. But who knows? I don't know. I would just say, I think I think it's almost a mistake to speculate about what they want from the deal. I mean, political systems are fluid, and different constituencies want different things, and different constituencies have different amounts of power at different times. And at the moment,
well, we know what the Iranians want. They want to be reintegrated into the world economy, and they want to end these very different. It's a form of economic warfare. It's basically saying that Iran's central bank and its banking system is going to be blacklisted from the world economy.
Well, I think it would be great. I think it'd be great if they were economically integrated. I mean, how has the opposite worked out in Cuba? Has that worked out fine? I mean, remind me, are they now a robust democracy with fierce regard for human rights?
The blacklisting of the Iranian economy has forced them to finally come to the table. That's what the White House
on
said.
The nuclear issue.
The sanctions worked. That's what they said.
On the nuclear issue, but there had not been true engagement for a long time before this became a deal, right? Because of the whole history of the U.S. and Iran.
Well, there have been secret talks that we're now reading about, and I've heard I'm working on something on that too. So, but it's secret talks have always happened between the United States and Iran. But you're right; they're an enemy because the Iranians have killed Americans. They're that's what they do. So here's
wait a second, Eli. And what Israelis do is assassinate Iranian civilians by your own account. I mean, let's don't act like this is black and white.
Well, I think that there's an absolutely quality.
And what America did, by the way, is
the rest of the civilized world. That's what I would say.
And what America did was
based on it's not an opinion. I think it's borne out by the facts. This is a regime that has repeatedly repressed the democratic aspirations of its own people. It's a regime that encourages at the highest levels an almost kind of racist theology that it encourages. It's not just anti-Semitism, which suppose I'm more sensitive to as a Jew. It is a dominant kind of thing. They are a regime that has used terrorism to advance their statecraft almost from the very beginning of their revolution. If you look at the history of who's in power, and when there have been reform movements, in almost every single case, when there has been an effort to try to reform the system, the reformers have been sidelined, often arrested, sometimes tortured, sometimes murdered. It's a very long history. The current regime has a very long blood debt that it owes to their own people, starting with their own people, but also to its region and also to Americans, because they were behind a very nasty and vicious campaign in Iraq and Afghanistan to try to kill U.S. soldiers in that country as well. So there is a long history there. And that long history is something that I think, largely speaking, is not a reaction to American hegemony, imperialism, Zionism, occupation, what have you. I think it's because it's the nature of its revolutionary regime.
Well, I would say, first of all, the nature of its revolutionary regime is in no small part a reaction, or at least its attitude toward America and some of America's allies, is a reaction to the fact that the United States did support a coup that overthrew a democratically elected regime in Iran and installed a brutal dictator who was then overthrown by the revolutionary regime. And I don't think you can ignore that. What we did was just wrong. I think by your own account, you'd say overthrowing democratic regimes and installing dictators, that's not something you're in favor of, I don't think. So that was wrong.
No, I'm not.
And it had consequences.
But I just don't think that Mosaddegh, I think that too often I hear progressives throw out the Mosaddegh to try to explain, the behavior of the regime. Keep in mind, after the revolution, which was much more broadly supported than just people who supported an Islamic republic, it was supported by communists, Democrats, all kinds of opponents of the Shah. There were purges starting in the early days, and then continued again in 1988. And I think it's important to remember the current justice minister appointed by Rouhani, this so-called reformer, was one of the 3 judges who presided over the murder of thousands at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. This is there are different dynamics here, and I think that the history, of course, is very important, but it's also, I think, it only tells part of the story. We have to look at the fanaticism and of the regime and its willingness to use violence to,
I mean, look, this is going to shock you.
The whole region, I think.
This is going to shock you, Eli, but there are people who don't share your vantage point, who look at America's use of drone strikes and the ensuing death of civilians, who looks at a number of people killed by Israel in Gaza, and doesn't see a super clear moral line. They may be right, they may be wrong, but it's not. I don't think it's as black and white as you think. But in any event, I agree. There's a lot of.
I'm not saying black and white. What I'm saying is that you have to look at it in the context of it. And I really wanted to focus, because we're going to talk about the civil society issue.
Right.
In 2009, I think that it's fair to say the Iranian nation suffered a great wound when, the supporters of Mir Hussein Musavi and Karoubi were basically told that, that their supporters believed that the 2009 election was stolen, which is itself a political traumatic act. But then the crackdown afterwards, which saw so many kind of youthful activists that believed that they had this chance to sort of participate in the system, thrown in some of these temporary jails. The fact that Karoubi and Musavi remain under house arrest. There recently was a report that said that their health is failing, they should be allowed to leave. That is something that I would have hoped the West would have asked for as a condition for further normalization or for something. And we haven't seen evidence. Perhaps there's a secret channel in which we're negotiating for the end of their house arrest and the reintegration of this true reform movement in Iranian political life. I somehow doubt it.
Well,
and if Rouhani can say that he got a victory and never had to do really anything on this, this point, then didn't have to do anything. Well, then in a lot of ways, we've allowed I think in the West, I'm not saying we should invade. I'm not arguing for a USAID program. I'm just simply saying that we can use our diplomacy. We can use our carrot of giving them more legitimacy to at least try to get them to do something on this particular point. And I don't think we have, and I think that's bad for the opposition. It's bad for Iranian Democrats. It's bad for Iran.
Well, I mean, you can only get so much if you're only willing to give so much. And what we wanted to get, and what Israel said it most wanted to get, was stuff on the nuclear front. And that's what we focused on. And if you want other stuff on another front, you got to give up stuff on the nuclear front. That's the way things work in the real world. But beyond that, I agree. We would like to change both Iran's external behavior and the internal situation. The question is how you do it. A lot of people think that engagement can help. I think there's a fair amount of evidence in world history of that. But beyond that, they would also say this is a relatively progressive presidential regime in Iran at this moment, and you want to help it rather than hurt it, and this deal does give it more strength. And in any event, I would say, how do you account for...
I don't, unless he delivers. I mean, listen, if Rouhani is Gorbachev, I hope he is, and seeing a transformation in Iran, then that's great. I mean, that will solve a lot of problems. But the evidence of that, for me, will be how he addresses, and he promised in the campaign trail, I should say, to release more political prisoners. They said they released 80. As it turns out from Shireen Ebadi, she's called that a big lie, because the people that they released had their sentences already coming to an end, and she said all of the main people remain under arrest and so forth. But if he does begin to do that, then that's important. But so far, I don't think we've seen much evidence that he has.
How do you account for the fact that so many Iranians or Iranian Americans or whatever, who are commentators, who are clearly sympathetic to the Greens, support this deal?
I don't know. Maybe they're easily gulled. Maybe I can't speak for why people like Ali Kareem think that this is a good deal.
No, not just him, but, what's the guy at Brookings or Kareem Sajab, whatever.
I like Kareem.
Right, and he's sympathetic to the Greens.
I don't know that, I mean, I haven't.
Oh, he totally is.
I don't know that he would say this deal is good for the Green movement. I think he would say it's good for the West, it's good for international security. I don't know that he would say a deal absent any kind of political reform is good for them?
Well, we should ask him. We know that it's high. The Greens are reasonably high on his list of priorities. Someone I've talked to, Human Majd, I know. I think he's actually related to somebody prominent who's in jail, and is supportive of the deal. And you know, I mean, but seriously, you have to account. And there are some Iranian human rights activists who are supportive of the deal, but you know, we haven't done an exhaustive consensus. We don't know, but I would like you to show me some American commentators who are prominent, supportive of the Greens, and say that this is bad for the long-term human rights situation in Iran. I haven't heard much of that. Maybe there is some.
Listen, I'm going to give you my argument. In 2009, the regime was a coup d'etat regime, and the official statement from all of the Green spokesmen was there should be no negotiations with it. The Obama administration continued. There was another election in which the so-called moderate, Hassan Rouhani, who, by the way, was on the National Security Council in Iran in the 1990s and early 2000s when he authorized the crackdown on all the student demonstrators, not to mention also authorizing stupid things like the banning of satellites and so forth. So here's a guy who was associated for his entire political career as somebody who had an interest in upholding the regime and was considered a hardliner until very recently. And then he says, listen, this isn't very practical. These sanctions are really killing us. We need to do something. And yeah, I'd like to address the political prisoners. So there was a moment, I guess you could say, of hope, but he hasn't delivered on that. And it's very similar to Khatami, when Khatami campaigned as a reformer, but was unable to do things as all these reform newspapers and so forth were closed. And it leads to this point where, I mean, I don't want to speculate on why Human Majd thinks what he thinks. Human Majd has also been a very prominent defender of Iran's right to enrichment, and that, saying that the world's ganging up on Iran, and it is his right and so forth. But I just do not think the opposition, if they know what's good for them, could support a deal where there is rapprochement with the West and there's nothing on the human rights side of this. I mean, it's bad for them. It means that they get away with it. And that's just
but the truth is, engagement with the West makes it harder and harder for governments to remain harshly authoritarian. I mean, even, you will probably argue with this, but it seems to me there is no doubt, it's not arguable, that if you compare China on the eve of engagement, on the eve of Deng Xiaoping's initiative, with China now, in terms of the amount of input, practical input citizens have on policy, their ability to express their grievances, and see the actual human rights situation. As you may know, they just announced that they're going to end political re-education. I don't think you'll disagree with me that during the period of engagement, things have gotten better in China. What?
Certainly, China is not as repressive as it was under Mao.
That's what I'm saying.
There's a strong argument to say that with, internet technology and cell phone, camera phones and so forth as it is, it's almost impossible to have kinds of, truly awful purges and acts of repression that we saw of the 20th century. So, there is something to that. But I would say that China is in some ways, I don't know that it helps your argument. There has been enormous engagement with China. There's been enormous trade that has been brought to China. And there's certainly that there are arguments that are independent of human rights as to why we should do that. But it hasn't really made much of a difference in terms of how that system works. There's largely, a single party system in terms of the Communist
It is
Party.
single party.
And
it is much less repressive.
Largely by the military and people affiliated with the military. And there are limits to the amount of rights and so forth. Now, this is on the Iran question. My only point is that the leadership 4 years ago of the Green Movement asked the West to show solidarity and say that the condition of your normalization with the West for one, which is something I think the hardliners and the reformers want, should be to do something on this particular file having to do with the stolen election and the gross crackdowns that have happened in the country. And that never happened. It never materialized. And now there is this deal after this election and so forth. And maybe there is a secret understanding similar to the Cuban Missile Deal when, the U.S. agreed later on to take out missiles from Turkey. Maybe there's a component there. I hope certainly there is, where you're going to see more movement from Rouhani. But I want to transition to another point here, which is related to it, which is that I don't think you're going to have what the world wants, which is the full transparency to know that Iran's nuclear program will not be used to break out to a weapon until you get that political reform, which is to say the political reform is a necessary component of such a deal. The only time that we've ever been able to get a successful one of these denuclearization deals with a dictatorship was Libya. And you could argue that Libya certainly was successful from a non-proliferation perspective. But was it successful overall? Because eventually we ended up siding with, the country's opposition at the beginning of the Arab Spring. And so I say to you, I think one of the reasons this deal is likely to fail is because I don't see any evidence that the regime is going to deal with the wound of 2009 and begin the process of political reform, which would give the overall government and society the transparency needed to know that they're not cheating and trying to build new.
Well, I certainly think, the progress may be slow, even if we have engagement. The progress on the internal front may be slow. But even given that, even if there's no progress, I would say, you have to make your choices. And what, to me, a more urgent priority than internal reform in Iran seems to me to be, from a standpoint of human welfare of the human beings in that region, preventing war and stabilizing the region. And I think, maybe Bibi is all bluff. You tell me. But it seemed to me that in the absence of a negotiated deal, the chances of war with all its unpredictable consequences were unacceptably high.
I mean, there is a shadow war. There's an economic war. There's a terrorism war. So there's all of that. And, what's going on right now, I guess. So the question is, would there be a hot war? And
bombing is pretty hot. Bombing is pretty hot, and it tends to lead to hotness.
There's no doubt that bombing is pretty hot, but I would just say, it's hard to know what's bluster and what's not. But from just taking the public statements, this deal has breached the trust between America's most important allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Israel. And when when U.S. allies don't trust the United States to cut a good deal, which clearly I don't think Israel does trust Obama at this point, then that changes their own calculus, which is to say Obama has a lot of persuasion with the Israelis and to say, I need you not to do this. I'm your most important ally. And if the Israelis feel like this guy is going to let Iran build a nuke, then the Israelis have proven in the past they're willing to take matters into their own hands. So it's possible that what you think is this very good deal or the beginning of a good deal or an interim deal or good negotiations could be just building up to a point where the Israelis saying, screw it, we gotta defend ourselves. Because that for them is they don't want to have an Iran that has like a Japan-like ability to break out and build a nuke when they want. And they've said that they're willing to stop that.
Well, but the deal, even in the next 6 months, keeps them at least as far away from breakout, moves them further away from breakout than they are. Presumably, the comprehensive deal, if it happens, and it's not guaranteed, would at a minimum preserve that. So if Israel hasn't bombed yet, I don't know how they would possibly justify doing it or why they would do it. Because for Iran to have breakout capacity in some kind of, distant sense is actually a pretty stable state. I mean, the funny thing about actually having nuclear weapons is nobody believes you'll use them. Whereas if you have breakout capacity, people do kind of think you might develop the weapons, so you actually have a little leverage then.
Okay, I think the problem from not just Israel, but the problem from like the world's perspective is that what you don't want is for Iran to have as many centrifuges as they have now, running and saying that they could turn on and build the fuel for a nuclear weapon whenever they want. That's what you don't want. So if you can get to a point where they really begin dismantling that and you have far fewer centrifuges, then I think all of this is going to be a tempest in the teapot and the Israelis will come around to it. The problem is they don't see that necessarily coming, and if they don't see that coming, then they're saying, well, it's unacceptable to us to like have a deal where the sanctions basically get lifted and they still have 18,000 centrifuges spinning and so forth. And I mean, at that point, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get into a situation like Jeffrey Goldberg where you predict whether Israel will or won't. I mean, it's been happening for almost 10 years where people do that, and everyone's wrong that's predicted that they would at this point. And I know enough to know that I have pretty good sources in Israel, but I know that I wouldn't know the details or calculations leading up to that at that moment. I think it would be a surprise to everyone. But I don't think that it's necessarily true that a deal gets us further away from war. I think it's possible where I could see a scenario where this deal would actually lead to war.
Well, I mean, we should say, if what you're saying is that Israel could see the status quo as justification for bombing, I mean, we should say that as things stand now, in terms of developing a deliverable weapon, you know.
I don't know how far. I mean, I never.
More than a year away.
I don't buy this argument that, like, I think, as I understand it, the U.S. intelligence estimate from 2007 was that Iran had not decided to weaponize. But they have all these components that they're right up to the finish line. And, you know, that's why we come to this point where they want to have a breakout capability. So, I mean, I'm just pointing out here that I think that they do want to have it to that point. And that's really like what we're talking about. We're talking about whether or not Iran can be on the precipice of putting a nuclear weapon together, and that would be enough to lift the sanctions and begin to do, you know, all this other stuff, and how far away you're going to get them from that precipice. Okay. And I'm still holding out prospect that, you know, maybe all this will lead to a point where they end up 6 months from now much further away, and then it'll be a great success for Obama, and, you know, he will be duly credited. But it could also lead to a point where nobody believes it, the negotiations break down, and, you know, we end up getting closer to war because of it.
Well, before I graciously give you the last word, I would say that even the deal as it stands right now, if your concern is that they would go for breakout, the monitoring that this puts in effect would give Israel and the world the clearest possible notice that they could get that they were going for breakout. I mean, again, there's cameras in the facilities you're talking about. They are inspected. They can be inspected every day to make sure they haven't been tampered with. In the absence of some such deal, you don't have that. Now, you may worry about, undeclared sites, but as I said, the final deal is going to provide the capacity for challenge inspections. And if you compare that to what you would have in the absence of a deal, it seems clearly superior. So it seems to me that what this thing does, regardless almost of exactly what form the final deal takes, is provide the best practical triggering mechanism you can imagine, in the sense of the best possible system for detecting an Iranian attempt to break out and develop a nuclear weapon. Having said that, I will now yield the floor to you, and regardless of how vulnerable whatever you say seems to counterattack, I will refrain from the counterattack.
Well, I like the blogging heads because we're not formally related. We're having a conversation.
A dialogue. It's a dialogue.
I don't know if I have any more last thing. I think it's a very serious issue that the leaders of the Green Movement remain under house arrest. And if they are released from house arrest and allowed to participate in Iranian political politics, and you can begin to sort of see that again, well, that to me would actually go a long way in removing some of my suspicions about the nuclear program. And I think, I know I'm supposed to have the last word, you would agree with that? Is that right? That would be an important good faith measure? I would say it should have been for progressives, and, you know, in general, it should have been a higher priority. But I think that, you know, would you agree with that?
So I'm allowed to talk, even though I said I'd give you the last word because you asked me a question. Do I think it would be? I think it'd be nice if they released the Greens. Again, if you look at all the other things we could try to get in this comprehensive deal, I would not make it the highest priority, and I would not make it a prerequisite for a comprehensive deal. I would, if I were going to get beyond the nuclear issue and start making demands on Iran, I would start talking about external behavior. I would start trying to get them to play a productive role in winding down the Syrian war or things like that.
If you let them terrorize their people at home, they'll continue to terrorize their neighbors.
Couldn't it work in reverse if you stopped? I mean, where did this system come from?
I think that it gets to the nature of the regime, and I think that it gets at a very important point, and I think it's something that they won't give up. I think the Iranian view in this is that they are basically arguing they want to preserve the regime, they want legitimacy from the West, and in exchange they're willing to give more kind of transparency. And maybe that's good enough because we don't live in an ideal world. I've been chastened by, certainly foreign policy, I think sometimes can be too idealistic. So you have to deal with the pragmatics of it. It's one of the reasons I like being a reporter is I don't have to come up with these final things. But I do think that that's an important point that's been largely lost in the discussion. And I appreciate having that discussion with you.
Okay, that is the last word. Thank you, Eli Lake. We'll link to your Iran oeuvre, or at least parts of it, including these last couple of pieces you've just written. I think within the last 24 hours or so, right?
That's right. In the last 12 hours. Thank you, Bob.
We'll do that. Thanks, Eli.
Okay.
See you.
Okay.